right. Hey, what's up, everybody? All right. Welcome to ADPList Tech Hustle number 3. We're going to be talking about design ops today with Charlie Weston. So real quick, I'm going to introduce you, Charlie, and you can tell us a little bit more about yourself. But Charlie is a senior designer at Atlassian. He works with cross-functional teams to build workflows for customers that are personalized, actionable, and transparent. Charlie believes in helping teams balance multifaceted business requirements with user expectations and technical feasibility through iterative development. He has 8+ years of experience working with B2B groups across startup, enterprise, and consultancy space. So I'm really excited to talk to Charlie today about design ops. Charlie, welcome to Tech Hustle. It's awesome to have you, man.
Jeremy, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Awesome. All right. So before we hop into it, got a couple of ground rules we want to talk about today and just a little stuff, promote ADPList a little bit. So just a little bit about ADPList. We're a global community. We're based on genuine connections, and our mission is to foster an inclusive space and support network and a support network for designers to come together, learn from each other, strive to be better. This is just a few of the many companies that our mentors work for. So check out ADPList and don't hesitate to sign up if you haven't already. A couple of awesome numbers here. We got 3,000 plus mentors. That's amazing. 12,000 plus one-on-one sessions and growing every day. We do 100 more events across 70 countries. That's pretty amazing. A couple of quick guidelines. So we're going to be recording and by attending, you grant your consent. We'll be posting this on YouTube and other places online. Absolutely no hate speech or discriminatory behavior. If you do, you're out. We'll be taking a group selfie in a little bit. So if you want, turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable. And then when this is over, make sure you post all your takeaways on social media, tag ADPList at ADPList, and then use the hashtag Tech Hustle. And that way we'll be able to find you. And as always, let us know feedback, ideas for improvement, all that stuff. We'd love to hear from you. And I think that's it. I'm going to stop sharing right now and we will get into it. So Charlie, tell us a little bit about you, and we'll go from there, man.
Yeah, so I'm, as you nice to say in the beginning, I'm a designer at Atlassian. I have experience over a period of about 8 years or so working with startups, enterprise groups, consultancies, really helping teams understand how to make the digital feel human. There's a huge opportunity in the B2B space with just new technology coming out, with startups popping up every day, with new teams or enterprise groups really understanding how they can involve tech into their business flow to create experiences that are very clear, transparent, and easy for customers to jump in, understand what they're doing, and get out and get back to their day.
All right. So we are talking about design ops today. So this is sort of a relatively new term. People probably heard DevOps, DevSecOps, things like that. And design ops is sort of the design answer to those things. But talk a little bit about design ops specifically. And what is that? What does that mean when you say design? Does that mean?
Yeah, at a very high level, it's the optimization of people and process. And that can mean different things for different teams based on where you're at in your org, what your org is like, or even what your immediate goals are. But I mean, essentially, how do you instill standardization so that teams can work together more transparently, get work done faster, and then measure the impact and make sure that process is repeatable over a period of time?
Yeah. So when we talk about DevOps, what is it that we're looking for? Why do we care? What is like the value that companies get out of this versus maybe, I don't know, what we were doing 5 years ago?
Yeah, I mean it's similar to the appeal and the benefit that design systems have gotten. And that's probably the easy example for teams to understand and get. It's how do you have to remove the ability to recreate the wheel every single time you're going out building processes. So an example of that would be, again, design system is probably the easiest thing for people to understand, grasp their head on. But like, how do you look at ways for teams to scale effort over periods of time? That can also trickle down into ways like, what are meeting cadences for how do you spec out projects? How do you have standards of documentation so that if you have two different teams that are working on maybe different sides of the house, that they're not building experiences or systems or flows that are maybe disparate or conflicting with each other? So it can mean it can exist in different ways, but the crux of what it's solving is that need for consistency and standardization at a very base level.
Yeah.
But different teams have different understandings of that, and I'd be curious what your thoughts on based on your experience.
So I mean, from my perspective, I think it's similar. My role as experienced architect is certainly at like a higher like strategic level.
Right.
I think a lot of times design ops and tech ops, DevOps, they sort of talk about it's really focused on the tactical execution. What's the
Hmm.
process for releasing? What's the process for going from code to build to release
Hmm.
to production, things like that. When you talk about DevOps, it's similar, I think, with design ops. From my perspective, it's a lot of like making sure that as we work across teams, our teams know how to work with the design team, even at
Hmm.
like that strategic level,
Right.
right? So instead of just going and finding requirements and handing it a set of user stories to go and build, and then in that case you might be using some of this tactical execution like the design system to quickly iterate on a design or prototype or something. But it goes back, I think, up to the strategic level when we talk about how does the team work with the UX team, instead of being like order takers
Hmm.
to helping solve problems. When do you include us? At what point do we create service blueprints? Should we expect service blueprints? Does every problem
Hmm.
need a service blueprint? Does every problem need some research plan? Does every problem need research? All those things that happen well before we get down to the
Hmm.
tactical execution. And that's kind of where I live a little bit. And that process, defining that process, making sure everybody understands it, so that if a new person comes on the team, we say, this is how we work with the UX team.
Hmm.
And making sure that's consistent, especially at a company like GE, so big. Um, Teams move around quite a bit, and it's
Hmm.
often you'll find people work a couple of years in a role and then move on to some other role. And so constantly changing. Imagine like how difficult it would be to build software if every 2 years you had a completely different process.
Right.
So I think that's kind of where my perspective on DevOps or DevOps design ops comes in.
Well, and that's interesting even with that because I mean, there's a probably a dividing line between what does it look like at a management level, senior leadership
Mhm.
versus more senior IC, where you're coming in like rolling up sleeves, going in the weeds every day, looking at what that process looks like because it has to exist in different ways. And I think what's interesting to look at is design ops as a actual like tactical role, something similar to what you mentioned, and what is like a mindset, like what are ways that you can
Yeah.
take principles of that if you're not an organization that maybe startup of maybe 10, 20 people that doesn't really have the structure to lend itself to hire somebody that's going to be a senior design manager, or somebody that's going to specialize in design or DevOps. Having understanding what those principles are and what are the main key components or pillars, and tying that into individual roles so that it doesn't matter what type of team you join or what maybe your role is, what are basic tenets that you can follow that are instilling better practice and moving your organization into a more design ops thinking type
Right.
situation, similar to how we measure UX maturity within organizations.
Yeah. I think like to your point, you mentioned like leadership. I think a lot of it should be coming from the top. So like this is how we do it as a team.
Hmm.
I think one of the things I've seen a lot, and this is sort of where maybe I think design ops kind of evolved, was coming from agile teams. Very much had if you think about back in the day when agile first started, it was like decentralized. The teams are going to
Hmm.
work the way they want to work, and so the developers decided this is our process for this one pod, and another pod at a different process, and another pod at a different process. I think the problem with that was as it started to scale, you said, like, well, what's our process? Everybody's got a different process. How are we working together? And
Hmm.
so I think like same kind of thing evolved here is like, how do design teams work with engineers?
Hmm.
Are we just designing user stories? Do we have some say in what those user stories should be, and how does that flow down?
Hmm.
And so I think that's sort of like there's certainly an organic aspect to it, grassroots kind of, where we got to understand what our process should be. But at some point, there should be that person, that role up at the top that says, this is it. We've solidified it, and it can change for sure, but this is how we should all try to follow this process so that we're as efficient as possible. So we bring value back to the business.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting with even that is like there's different levels of cut it, right? Because there's probably
Mhm.
standardizations where it's this is the hard and fast rule for this is our shared definition of done, that many organizations have to understand. Okay, this product is good to go. This we can ship this, but then I'd be curious to get into maybe later on, like how do you break out like what are elements that are actual like standard principles and what are things that are maybe more fluid that teams can kind of decide for themselves that are maybe it might seem like a big deal, but in the bigger picture are more ancillary.
Like more like freedom in a framework. kind of a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that could even be that of like, how much, when you take on a project, like, to your question about when do we need a service blueprint, like, well, how much research do we need to have done to understand how to solve this problem statement? Like that,
Mhm.
those are questions like that, you know, is that a team level decision? Is that a management level decision? That's different companies probably work different ways to structure that.
Yeah. So you've been doing this for eight plus years. I'm curious. Design ops is sort of a relatively new term, right? I mean, it's like as an official capacity. What were you doing before, or how were your teams working before?
Hmm.
So it's kind of maybe some people out there who aren't really familiar with the term design ops, or if they're new, they've only ever known working this way. Maybe talk about a little bit before that. What was it like before we had this in the dark ages, if you will, and how did it kind of from your perspective, like how did you kind of evolve into this?
Yeah, I mean, I was reading or listening to a podcast from Meredith Black, who was I believe she still is now the head of design over at Pinterest, and she was reminiscing on what the evolution of design ops and what does that look like from a decades long history looking at that, and more decades in the design career. But it's interesting. Her career started off with agency life, and similar to mine, like I worked in agencies before, in the advertising space before getting into tech. And there's a mentality sometimes that shops like that, they're very scrappy. That are trying to make sure they complete projects on the deadline. Is you do whatever needs to get done to get the project over the fence. And in similar cases, when you're looking at teams that maybe don't have a very mature understanding of or the capacity to scale design ops, and you're trying to instill that in, those teams are probably working in that same capacity of doing whatever they have to get products over the finish line, and make sure that it happens as it needs to. I Prior to really looking at good standardization practices, that's what a lot of teams are looking at day-to-day basis. And it doesn't matter if you're a 20-person startup. It doesn't matter if you're a Fortune 500 company that just started looking at how to bring dev and design in-house and actually work with your business teams to build products at scale. Um, it, I think a challenge is just understanding where you need to start to build in standardizations and how to look at how to hire the right people to get the jobs that you need done.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned advertising and that sort of project-based approach to building
Hmm.
things. We have someone paid us for this very specific thing, and when we're done, we're done. And if they come back and
Right.
want to iterate on it, great. But over time, as we started to work for these bigger SaaS companies that own their own products and they're doing this stuff in house, those projects are never done. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we standardize this process if we're going to be doing this indefinitely? We can't just
Hmm.
do whatever we got to do to get it done. We need to keep it consistent so that we have a consistent result. We have a consistent product. We're not letting stuff slip
Hmm.
through the cracks and for the sake of rushing. And so I don't know. This sort of something just made me think of that. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. But that idea of like continuous improvement, constantly changing, making it better, iterating, testing, iterating, testing. Um, I don't know. So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that goes back to the idea earlier of design ops as a mindset. I mean, it's the take out design, it's operations scale. Like, how do we look at a process and make sure that's repeatable over time, whether that's building software, shipping code, or baking bread, right? Like, what is the process that you're looking at, and what checkpoints and what governance models do you need to put into place to make sure that you can have good, repeatable work on a standardized scale? And that's not to say that all work that designers do, that developers do, anything alike is standardized and rinse and repeat. But there's a value to have that centralized process. And to your point, even before that, that's why we work in agile. That's why scrum models work, because we found this really great way to work in short cadences, that we can try different ideas and we can push it out. So it allows us to, one, have a repeatable formula for how we develop software, but also we have the ability to test and push code out at different intervals to see, okay, what is the value here? So then we have that ability to do a catch-all reset, go back and iterate more on those concepts if we fully need to. Um, I think that's the benefit. And when you're looking at the value of it, it's how do you scale that operations? I don't know many groups and teams that have thought, I'm okay with starting at scratch every single time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, it's interesting because like a lot of like bigger companies they have these things established, but a lot of the smaller companies you sort of have to kind of build your own thing, right? Like you
Yeah.
go start a startup, you gotta create your own design system from scratch. You have to create your own
Hmm.
processes from scratch. You have to create your own templates or whatever from scratch. So I'm
Hmm.
curious, like from your perspective, maybe you have some stories, anecdotes or something. But back in the early days when you're working at startups before Atlassian, what was that like not having that established process? I mean, was there, what did it cost you? What were the things that happened because you didn't have those things in place?
The biggest costs are time, right? I mean, that's your, but there's a delicate balance of that. There were parts where I was one of the founding designers of a startup called Cohesion, and the business model was essentially how do we take disparate systems within a building suite and put it together. So that's your HVAC, visitor management, ID cards, all those things are managed separately. How do we build it into one app so that tenants can more easily access it and it's easier to scale for the building manager? But with that, it's a new org. I joined. We had a lot of engineers that were working on building the products, but there was no designer basically working on this. It was a lot of CEO, CTO, hand scriven artifacts that were handed off to developers, and there was a lot of interpretation for what that meant and how that looked like. So the first thing you step in those roles is what is the best way that we can standardize
Mhm.
this process and this practice, and how do we make sure that developers understand what consistency looks like at different levels? And I think the biggest benefit for that is that teams at a very base level can understand how they can scale these designs.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a little bit about how Atlassian does it. And I'm curious, from like a giant company like Atlassian, um, what is the process for this? Does Atlassian have official DevOps or design ops
Hmm.
roles, or DevOps too? I mean, maybe they all work together. Does the DevOps team and the design ops team work together? Do they chat all the time? How does that? What's that process like at a big company like Atlassian?
Yes, I mean we definitely have design ops and developer ops situated roles. We also have those responsibilities, between individual ICs, but also product program managers that come in and look at, how do we instill this process across admin functions or across product suites so that things scale over time. And Atlassian is great with actually building playbooks that are used internally, but also shared externally for different teams that are looking to scale different groups and organizations. So the information that we take and we understand it works really well, we're able to scale it and provide it to other teams so that they can leverage our success and go from there.
And I assume you use Confluence.
Yes, very much big into Confluence.
Like your own
Confluence,
dog food.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's awesome. So in this case, like if you don't mind going a little bit deeper, like the dev, what is a design ops team really doing every day? Is there some interaction that they have with the upper management, low, the folks down below? Are they working with the DevOps team as to show like this parallel process, or what does that generally look like if teams haven't had a chance to experience it? You might be able to.
Yeah, I mean, so again, it's a level of cross pollination
Mhm.
between different teams sharing, better practices. It Atlassian is a very transparent, open company. So, as things work, we're very communicative for, what's happening, what's working, what's not. It's a very company that's big in, retros and understanding how do we, take a perspective look at what's happened over the last quarter, and, affect it over the next couple to make sure we're not, we're basically making the best decisions going forward for our product teams and
Mhm.
our software stack. But yeah, I mean, it's you're looking at what are the different operational ways. And again, what's interesting is you have it at different levels at like super senior leadership, but that are dedicated design op roles. But you also have those pillars and instincts instilled at program manager, product managers, and like individual ICs that
Yeah.
are working, so everyone understands generally what good looks like in the process going forward.
So one of the things I'm curious about is just this idea of buy-in from upper
Mhm.
management and the folks who would be supporting these types of activities. I think UX teams, they know we need a process. We got to get this right. We're redoing this every time. Why are we doing this process over and
Mhm.
over again? And every time it's something new. So we understand that. I'm curious from maybe Atlassian to just have a team up at the top who, supports that. But in your previous roles, other roles, smaller companies perhaps, how did you go about, or how did your teams go about getting buy-in so that you could establish these things and make this some type of guardrails or best practice or something if you didn't have a design ops team?
Yeah, I think the biggest way to get buy-in is show it in practice, right? Like what I mean, even if you have a problem that you generally understand, define it, show what the impact is in some measurable way. Like what is the time lost? What is the money lost? Or what is just the confusion that a lack of system causes?
Mhm.
And then build a prototype of it, and that could be a Confluence document. It could be a schematic of here's how intake orders should be taken for when we get new design requests. Here is a better way to capture notes because we believe that allowing stakeholders to put notes in a single file versus volleying over by emails, is not the best way to build cohesion across complete stack. It's really showing what it can look like because operational models are hard to immediately conceive and understand the impact and what it actually means. So the sooner somebody can see it in practice, the sooner somebody can give feedback. And the best thing about buy-in, the best way to do it is with a lot of people. And what that really means, and what I try to think of it as in practice, is bring people into the room, say, I have an idea proposal for something, and then have other people submit opinions, make other people feel like they have a stake in the game for what's happening. Because the more you do that, the easier it is for people to, one, come on board and feel like it's something that the group has decided on versus like a mandated top-down situation where um,
Yeah.
it's this is the decree and this is how you have to work. By letting people feel like they have a voice in that conversation, they're more willing to listen, they're more willing to probably accept it and actually do the work and then evangelize it, if and when that actually shows to be a success.
Yeah, I really love that approach too. I think one of the things that helps to show, and maybe this is not as big of a problem as it was maybe 5 years ago, but
Hmm.
oftentimes I've seen UX teams sort of treated like, oh, they just make things pretty. Send them
Yeah.
send them the stuff. We already know what it needs. Just move the pixels around so it looks nice. And I think one of the things like you're talking about here is it takes the UX designer out of that designer role, where it's just designing pixels, into more of a problem solving role. And
Hmm.
when you can bring that whole team together and you say, hey, the UX team solving problems, maybe we should
Right.
include them in other problems that we have, and instead of just asking them to make things pretty, kind of
Yeah.
taking that approach.
I mean, because that changes the model. Because you think about the history of design. It didn't start with product design. It didn't start with building and tech. It started with like graphic design or work that was very creative nature, where it's an ask. It's something where um, I have the need for art that expresses this feeling, that shows this message. It's subjective. It's not something that has a lot of right or wrong impact from the business. It serves a message. It's a campaign, to lack of a better term. Moving into where we are now, though, we're in roles that it's important that the work that we do is strategic and thoughtful, and that we are really understanding what is the space we're solving for. And
Mhm.
that's I think just that nuance and understanding how the mentality shifted is interesting. Just understand, what does that mean for further buy-in? How do you show the value of what the work is? Because not everyone understands that long history, and if that you know that background information is lost, you can't explain it that way. But probably a better way to show that impact is to build in the process and show in what is the value of building software or even design the right way, in a way that's human centric and transparent.
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the things I think our the design role, or every design role, I think we benefit from
Hmm.
understanding the business, why this product exists. A lot of times designers are like, I'm not a business person. Like, bull crap. Like, you're designing for a
Hmm.
company that's trying to sell a product and make money. You really need to understand the business. And so focusing on that and understanding the problem space and understanding the things that we're trying to do and the problems our users have, and really diving into that and showing that value back to the leadership team who, and if you're not lucky enough to work at a company
Hmm.
that values design, that's how you get them to value design, is to show how you're increasing value by taking this design thinking approach or whatever it is that you,
Hmm.
however you want to do it, and saying, look, you can almost tie a monetary value to it, right? If we were to do this, we would
Hmm.
get X users and they would have, whatever, we wouldn't have as much traction or whatever KPIs you might use. But if you could tie that back to the business value and show how all of this is adding value and we're saving money and we're
Hmm.
increasing revenue at the same time, you end up getting that seat at the table, or bigger seat, a taller seat than you did before.
Right.
And I think that's key, right? I think that's a lot of times designers coming into the field new, I think often you just want to focus on design. And I think that's the big thing with a lot of this. It's like you're not even thinking about design anymore, really. You're not thinking about color theory, topography, all that stuff. You're
Hmm.
thinking about the process, how you execute, how you work with the rest of the team to get down to be able to do those pretty designs that you want to do.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if you want to go into this, but like, I'd be curious your thoughts on like what are ways to measure that impact. Like, say you don't have that time to go and develop this and deploy it
Uh-huh.
and then test and hope you have enough users to hit critical mass to,
Yeah.
understand is this feasible? Like I one of the things I think it's really interesting is you can do testing, you can do paper prototypes, but a good way to do that for buy-in even as well is like pure testing. So that's
Mhm.
pure is practical usability by experts. Um, if you're not
I've
familiar
never
with
heard it. Yeah.
so the methodology is basically a you take a flow that is pretty standard based on core traits. So you can actually do this with non-designers, and I've seen it run with stakeholder product managers as a good way for them to understand the process. But essentially, what you're doing is you're getting a very targeted persona, mapping out critical tasks in the flow, and you can have that stakeholder go through. It could be
Mhm.
Envision, it could be Figma prototypes, it could be the actual live website, and actually doing a scoring of how hard are the steps on a
Mhm.
gradient level at completion. And then if you take that and then you run through 3 or 4 tasks and you have a couple people do it, you can actually get a really good read of what are the current pain points in that process. Everyone
Mhm.
has to be really hyper familiar with what is the customer's perception and mindset in that flow, but it's a good way to maybe get buy-in and get consentment around a design or maybe the challenges in an area without having to go through the entire development and deployment process.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question because I work in enterprise, obviously, and the users of my tools generally are um, internal employees, G employees,
Hmm.
or it could be external Delta employees, KLM, airlines, things like that. They're using our tool, and so from my perspective, when I think of value, I think of it could be something like time on task, right? That person has a set value per hour or minute or something based on their
Hmm.
salary, and the faster they can do their work, the more they can do, and so they're increasing their value, right? And so you
Right.
could do some experiment where you measure time on task before and after, and you can say, if we were able to do this research and we're able to do this stuff, I can then present to you a level of savings and tie a dollar value to
Hmm.
that. When you're thinking about commercial applications, and it could be Jane Doe, the soccer mom, using it versus like Bill, the plumber or something. How do you tie a value to that? I don't know. That's an interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, but I'm sure someone's figured that out. Nielsen
Hmm.
Norman Group or somebody may have looked into that. But that's an interesting thought experiment. How you would gauge value might completely depend on the space that you're in, the industry, whatever. It's interesting. I don't
Completely.
know.
And what is the value? Again, you're talking value of rate of return of if we do this process it's going to work, but also what is the value of getting that buy-in early on, because if
Oh
the
yeah.
less uphill battles you have to have through that discovery and
Hmm.
deployment process,
Yeah.
the faster you can run, maybe the sooner you can ship and start to measure results.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah, I think like I'm guessing. DevOps, probably the buy-in there was like, look, our teams are spending X amount of hours every week doing this process over and over again. What if we standardize it, make it something that they don't have to think about, and we now save X amount of hours? That's whether you put a monetary value to that or not. I imagine, you could probably do a similar thing, I guess, with DesignOps, where you say, like, our designers are spending all this time redoing this every time, reinventing the wheel every time. What if we standardize this and made this simpler? Or we have, this learning curve every time people switch teams and things like that. And it would save X amount of time. We'd be able to be more, release often, however you want to, more releases per quarter. I don't know how you would tie that down.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting.
Well, I mean, and I did that exactly at JLL, where I was a lead designer, and we had the similar issue where we had 20 different buttons across 10 different products, and
Mhm.
we did a cost estimate. I think it was, six to $10,000 or something per new button that was designed from the ideation phase all the way through development. And if you compound that across, like, buttons aren't that complex, but what are all the components
Yeah.
that need to go into it? If you scale it out, okay, so here's a pretty rock solid business case where we have a lot of components and we don't have a lot of standardization. Why don't we start actually building some kind of governance model for that?
Yeah, that's an awesome point. All right, so question then. As it states today, I'm sure it's not perfect. What are some thoughts from your perspective on what we still need to improve, where we still need to go? Any thoughts there?
I think the biggest thing is communication. But in no order. Communication, um, hiring the right type of talent that understands the need for, like, when you know when to bring in senior leadership versus a principal IC. Like, what are those decision lineations at? Communication really around how do we make sure that teams can articulate what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Mhm.
I think that's really important for designers to be able to write, to be able to explain. Okay, here's the process. Here's what my thinking was, and here's the output of it. Here's why I decided to go this route. That's important too, to make sure that teams understand. Why is the process needed? What is the methodology thinking in this playbook? Here's why we measure this metric in this way. Here's why we understand this to be better solution overall. And then just communication on principles and just getting alignment, because I think maybe more so than development, design can be incredibly territorial. A lot of people think that this is my process, this is my look and feel. There seems to be sometimes a fear of too much governance or oversight, constricting designers and not allowing them to design as freely maybe as they want to. But that it's kind of the pull with working within a centralized system. You have to fall within some kind of level of guidelines if you're working in a centralized way, unless you just want to go completely decentralized. But then you still run into that same problem. That's why
Yeah.
DevOps was made, and that's why DesignOps was made more
Yeah.
recently. So
Well, that's the thing I think a lot of people don't realize. I think when we think about UX designers, we're not artists. Some of us might be artists, but our job is not to be an artist. And we can certainly play around with the rules that we're given, but at the end of the day, our job is to create value for an end user, right?
mhm.
And if that value is created by having a consistent experience, right, that I understand as a user, whenever I go to this app or this page, even if it's built by different teams or designed by different designers, it's consistent. And the value of that consistency and that brand is really what we're working towards when we think about this whole, I think, design ops process. And so you certainly can be creative. I'm not saying that, but I think when it comes to design systems specifically, we establish colors, we establish
Mhm.
topography rules, we establish components for a reason, because as we scale, we've got to make sure that designer one and designer two are designing a cohesive system that work together so that the user understands it. And I think that's the big thing. When I think of this, like where you're talking about, it's like, yeah, you can go and be creative and solve problems in interesting ways, but with the framework that you're given, so that the
Right.
user is not put off or just not jarring and they're confused. And why is the button on the left here, but the button's on the right over here? Why is the topography different? Or this looks like a heading 1, but that's a heading 3 over here, whatever it is.
Right.
That becomes just super confusing. And yeah, I personally, I don't know about a lot of people, but like, I feel like I feel like I can go and design more and be more efficient when I have some framework or some guidelines instead of someone saying, here's an empty white piece of paper, go design anything you want. It's much easier, I think, as designers to go and say, here's some limitations and some like a framework. Now go figure out something that works with this. And I don't know, that's me. Maybe I'm unique. I don't know.
No, well, I'd be curious the thoughts between is product design creative or artistic? I mean, I think there's a level of it that art and science with it. Art,
Yeah.
how creative can you be versus how like logical, strategic can you be in that sense? But I mean, yeah, I would completely agree. I mean, and the reason why I know that product design, UX design is often better with a level of framework around it is because we work in generally user stories, which tell us here's what we're trying to do, here's what the objective is, here's what good looks like for this, and here's how we know that we're ready to ship this. By not having those standards built in, you can build whatever you can take as long as you want, and that can be a great exploration exercise. But at the end of the day, that's probably not what a lot of us are lucky enough to get paid for is to just sit in a room and ponder the infinite.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's Don Norman has posted a lot of stuff recently about design education. And I think this kind of plays into design ops in that maybe tangentially. But he's got a huge problem with design education in how designers, UX designers or whoever, are being taught through the art schools at various colleges. And the problem with that is, from his perspective, art is for the artist, right? You're designing art and maybe you could sell it, but it's for you. This is what you wanted. And if someone wants to buy it, fine. But in our case, as designers, we were designing for someone else completely that might have completely different tastes, completely different thoughts on what good is. And so, we're designing for them, not for ourselves. And I think when I think of the difference between artist versus designer, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm not designing this interface because I think it looks good. I'm designing it because our research has told us that our users would think this thing is good. And so in that sense, I think it kind of relates to design ops because that is essentially you're following some process to get to, and you're defining good. Like you just mentioned this, like what is good? Who defines
Mhm.
good? I think design ops, that they define good. They've done some research on what is good and what is not. The design system, would using the design system, for instance, creates an objectively good interface. So I don't know. Anyway, I don't know. What do you think about? I don't.
Yeah,
Any thoughts?
no, it's
I would talk about that for like another hour.
yeah, what I will say with that is I'm not sure exactly what university or what programs he's looking at with that. I My background is from Savannah College of Art and Design, so I can fundamentally say like that is not the way that I understand a lot of university career programs look at. But I mean, if you or I guess the way to look at it is if you're going the route of coming from a creative school, make sure that there's a good foundation in what does actually design look like in the field that you're looking at, because design can mean 20 different things across 30 different disciplines based on how you want to cut it. But I, I would agree that there's probably a reworking of how we educate on design holistically across the board, whether that's boot camps, whether that's creative universities, whether that are state level schools, master's programs. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. Actually, like I said, we could probably talk for another hour about this, but he did a whole like research paper. It's like a 50-page research paper where he went and did all kinds of research from like Ivy League schools to wherever. And it's really interesting. And I don't know, Winona, maybe we could post that in the notes afterwards. If anyone wants to read a scholarly journal about the state of design education, it's actually a really interesting read. I'm sure there's like a summary of it somewhere you could probably find. But anyway, that's cool. So, all right, so we got about 15 minutes left. Anything else before we start going into Q&A that you want to make sure we hit on that we might not have talked about today?
I don't think so. I think we pretty much covered the major beats. I'm happy to dive back into anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Maybe we need another one of these. We talk about the state of design education. I think that's a super interesting. All right, so we have a question from somebody. How can designers best influence the road mapping exercise to influence what is being built and the product's direction?
What is the best way to impact the roadmap? Uh, I would probably say research. What as as designers, I think we're guardian maybe isn't the right word, but we are probably next to a dedicated UX researcher, the subject matter experts, or I think we should be to a degree on who our customers are and what their goals are, what their aspirations are, what they think about when they go through the process. When roadmaps are being built, and for anyone not familiar, roadmap is generally how you plan out, over a maybe month, 6 month, year, of what you're looking to build from a product level standpoint. Um, Injecting insights and learnings from your research is a good way to remind product owners, stakeholders, and anyone that's really in the room, of what are the major pain points you're looking to address, and rehash, memories, anecdotes. What are things that we heard out in the field talking to customers, that might influence the roadmap. At the end of the day, most companies, that is not the job of the designer to create and build and manage, but it is ultimately our goal to make sure we're advocating for the customers that we're talking to, um, and making sure that their goals and needs are met through the process that we're building.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I like that. I like that answer a lot, actually, research, because I think that's exactly how you go and influence some decision is with data, and our data backs this up. And then we found that X users want this feature and would find this feature. Nobody uses this. It could be also too, I think research could be, ethnographic on-site interviews, things like that.
Hmm.
Also be analytics, right? Looking at your sort of quantitative analytics, like nobody clicks this button, why would we enhance this feature,
Right.
right? So that kind of stuff as you go
Hmm.
through the roadmap, looking at just data in general, getting data to back up your ideas. Because I think what I've found when it comes to roadmaps is there's always some high level person that has an idea about what the product should or should not do, and often people default to them. Oh, they're the CEO, they're whatever. But
Hmm.
that data helps you counter it and say, well, listen, I think it could be, but let's do research. Let's find out. Oh, look, our research says nobody would use this. Why would we enhance that? Why would we build on that? And it could be
Hmm.
something you go into future research. What if they would want to? You could do some interviews or something. Anyway, I like that idea a lot. Backing up
Yeah.
your ideas with data. All right. Here's a question. Let's see. Is DesignOps a separate team? In Glassdoor, DesignOps salary is lower than a UX design salary. Is that? I don't know if you have any idea about that, but I don't know how those Glassdoor gets that stuff. It's probably just there's probably not a lot of people. I imagine there's less people doing design ops than designers, and so that salary
I,
must be. But I don't know
yeah,
how you.
I have no comment on salary and what that looks like. I mean, and that can be completely different based on where you're located, what type of team you're on, like that.
Right.
I, yeah,
So in that case, though, design ops is a separate role, though, in your experience.
you know, at mature enterprise groups, 100%. The
Mhm.
smaller, as you scale down to, 1,000 person company, it's more probably on your senior leadership roles, whether that be your design managers, whether that be your creative leads, or it could be sent solely to your, head ICs if you're at a incredibly small company. It
Yeah.
really depends on what is the structure of your team and
Yeah,
company.
I think that's something I've experienced as well. We don't have design ops teams at GE, but we do have teams that a UX team is really focused on process and establishing that and advocating for
Hmm.
it and documenting it and making sure people follow.
Yeah.
It's much easier when there are specific because they become the default. Like we do have DevOps, but we don't have design ops. But I think it's sort of an evolution. I think it'll come eventually. But I think as you get smaller companies, it just becomes on everybody to sort of which might be harder to execute or easier depending on the culture of the organization.
Hmm.
Um, all right, so this is an interesting question. When should a design team start dedicating a specific design ops for the team? And this is like kind of when working with a relatively small design team, early stage startups, it's not possible to have a specific design ops role. How should we as designers take part in starting out the process to help scalability? That's a long question, but I think you get the idea.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the easy answer to that is look for the areas, look for the gaps, that you can easily identify, and look for ways to remedy it. In lack of immediate direction, the best action is to just try out solutions and see what works. So, if there's a challenge in your organization where maybe Maybe every time you're briefed on a new feature or story, there's a central challenge of I don't understand exactly what we're solving for. A entry step into design ops could be, okay, what does that initial design briefing ticket look like? Like for me as a designer to work on a project, what essentially do I need to know across why we're doing this, who are we doing this for, what is the impact, how are we going to measure it, whatever those base things are. If you don't have that, a good entry design ops could be, okay, let's build a standardization of that, centralize it with your team, get buy-in from stakeholders as you need them to use it, and then just start to modify it as you go. I don't think that you need to have, I don't think you need to be on the NASDAQ to think about how to scale the operational efficiency of your organization.
Yeah, I think once you have more than one designer, you probably could do that. I think as you start to have two or three, you start to have variances in process because people just work differently. I think
Yeah.
that's exactly when you would want to have this kind of. You're not obviously not going to have an official design ops role for two designers, but I think it's up to the two designers to start thinking about sharing a library of sorts. You're not reading. How do you save files? What is the file name? Where does it go? Where does it live? How do we organize our files? How do we organize our meeting notes so that we can hop back and forth and read each other's stuff and get up to speed quickly? That kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I
and
think
that's the easiest example of like what is the bar for implementing design ops. Like if you and another person are working together, that is essentially that. As long as you are taking it and operationally scaling it, so you can use it as a template. Yeah, it's probably the easy way to think about it. As close as you get to a template, as you move north toward that, that is eventually into design op territory.
Okay, so this question I think kind of relates to that, but this was an interesting one, a hypothetical situation. Okay, you're hired as a first designer, and then you're working there for a few years. The startup suddenly grows, and you hire a bunch more designers. This one's asking, what are some critical things that you need to set up for future success?
So, I mean, you're looking at, yeah, I mean, you're looking at how do we, well, I mean, first off, in a role like that where you're definitely a subject matter expert in the design space, I would look at, is there an option for you to maybe move outside of a dedicated IC role? Maybe you're doing actual design work 25% of the time, and you're doing operational process work the lion's share of your time within the organization. So that could be looking at how do all the other designers you've just hired, how do they onboard to the system? How do they know where design files are kept? How do we share out specs with developers? What do notes look like for how components or flows look like? Any of that work that you're doing that that you're going to have to teach those 4 or 5 new hires that you're bringing on, that is an opportunity to document, bring out that process, and make sure that everyone is generally aligned to how you're working, but also you're able to take that feedback for maybe what's working, what's not, because the more people you add to the system, the more you're going to understand, what levers you need to pull to make it more optimal.
Okay, love it. All right, here's a question. I think we kind of already talked about this, but I'll just see if you have any other thoughts. But what are some insights you can give to a mid-level designer who's striving hard to be a senior designer? And what advice can you lay down for that person so that they can meet their target or goals? I don't know if this is generally related to design ops or not, but let's.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're striving to move forward from one goal to the other. I mean, this is not really a design ops answer, but I would say look at what your organization, deems as the benchmark for, level 1 to level 2 to level 3. As you're moving up, like look at what they're looking for. They're probably, I would imagine, in a more senior role, looking for you to advocate for the best. Look for ways to inject the best possible outcome into internal work, but also what's going to affect the customer. And the more you can start to think about those opportunities and start to work through what that could look like. And again, the cool thing with building operational models is you don't have to be right the first time. It's putting something on paper, getting feedback and perspectives on it, and then scaling it as you go. Jeremy, I'm curious if you have any extra thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's also true as well. I think showing value, just like kind of like we did talk about with design ops, like showing value, like how did you have value? Where did you bring value? I don't know. I don't have much to add to your answer, to be honest. I think it's pretty spot on.
Yeah.
No, that's good. All right, one other question here. Let's see, the UX is about UX writer. So how does a UX writer play a role in any of this, or is it just the designer and the researcher who has some say about the design? I don't know if this is
Um,
general
how
or
does
just,
it was the
I guess
content
UX,
designer?
well, how, yeah, does a UX writer play any role in any of the stuff we're talking about here?
I mean, I think anybody that works on I mean, we're saying design ops. When I think of design, I'm thinking of UX, content, and research. And
Got it.
everyone can have different terminologies for what those two mean, or what the terminology means. But I think if you're working on the design team, you're looking into some way for design ops. You could
Mhm.
also, I mean, I've read and heard about teams having research operations. Like if you're a dedicated researcher, maybe not working on a single team or squad, for more than a couple weeks out of the year, you're probably looking at a different realm of like, how do we build a backlog of customers to talk to? How do we, quickly scale out research frameworks so that we don't have to write a script every time?
Mhm.
What are ways that we can just generally democratize our research learning so that teams don't have to wonder, okay, well, I remember this research report from last quarter. Where the hell in this,
Yeah,
server
where
do
does
I
it go?
find it?
Yeah.
Right. So, I
And
mean, you're good.
yeah, I was gonna say like it's synthesizing. I think for that, like synthesizing research in a consistent way, so that I always have the data that I'm looking or reporting back in a similar format in a similar way, so that it's always in the same spot on a deck or Word doc, whatever you do, so that I can compare and contrast. I think that's the other thing I've noticed with we have at G we have a research guild, and it's similar to this. It's very organic. It's not very top down at all, but it's the team sharing templates and all these other things. Um, and that's something interesting too. And I've always found that to be a challenge as I go from team to team or NAPS within GE.
Right.
Like, well, that research is totally different. Like, I don't know. It's like I'm trying to do desk research from research that was done a year or two ago to get familiar with whatever, and it's very difficult to do that when everything is just totally inconsistent.
Yeah. No, completely understand.
Yeah. Cool. So I think UX writers, if anything, could just help with the documentation of all this. I think you'd make it better. One of the other things too, I think when we think about UX writers in general, is the idea of content governance, where I want to make sure. Again, I've got a bunch of developers that are, writing error messages, success messages.
Hmm.
Who writes those error messages and success messages? It's got to fit the tone and the voice of the brand. So there should be some governance around there. It's not necessarily design ops, because I think a lot of it could be, the FAQs, the help section, the documentation. How do you use a thing? The change log, the emails from the
Right.
marketing team. All these things have to have a consistent voice and tone to match the brand. I was talking to somebody recently, a mentor, about how they worked at Marriott, and every brand in Marriott has a different tone and voice. So one brand, the button might say, let's go. Another brand might say, let's do this. Right. And that's how that
Hmm.
you need to know. Like, that needs to be documented, obviously. Is that design ops? Is that how is that governed? Like, who determines what that says, and who checks that? So anyway, all that stuff is kind of interesting. And I think UX writers would probably have a say in making sure error messages should always say this, like it's not going to say, dearest user, there was an error, contact sysadmin, right? Like, what does that error message say? Who writes it? How's it documented? Where do you go to reference that? Who checks to make sure that it was done correctly? And I think UX writers have a large part in all that stuff. Anyway, cool. All right. Well, we got about 4 minutes left. Anybody else? Any questions before we wrap it up? If you do, throw them in there real quick. If not, Winona, I guess that's it. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us today. Any closing final thoughts? Anything you want to plug before you get out of here? Anything you got going on you want everybody?
I think the biggest takeaway from this, I would just say, is just reminder to everyone that ADP is a great organization to just connect with people, understand different perspectives from designers, and what are by understanding people's different pathways, we can better understand how we want to collectively move forward with this. Appreciate the opportunity to come chat today, and would encourage everyone to think about what are ways they can inject operational efficiencies into their working models. It doesn't have to be super advanced, but there's opportunities for everyone to look for ways to make the ways we work better. And I think that's on all of us to look at.
Absolutely. I think one thing I think about when I think about design ops is what are the stuff like I don't like to do, and I just want to be able to do my job. I want to do my work, and what can
Yeah.
be standardized, and write that down and document that and share it. And to me, that's kind of, all of this stuff that we're talking about is like, I just want to do my job. I just want to design some stuff. Don't make me
Completely.
think. Don't make me do all this other stuff, and let me focus on my role. So
Yeah.
anyway, all right, cool, awesome. Well, Winona, I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you both for a great session, and thank you everyone for coming out. And in case you wanted to rewatch this session will be uploaded to our YouTube channel before the end of the week. And have a great day. Have a great night, everyone.
Oh, one
Thank you
thing
so
I totally forgot. There is a really good ebook that Envision put out about DesignOps that I think we should maybe post in some things somewhere. It's a free ebook and you can go get it. It's really interesting. Great read. It's pretty quick. So anyway, that was one thing I meant to mention that earlier. I totally forgot. That's it.
All right.
I'll send you a
Thank
link.
you.
Cool.
All right.
All right.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Cool. Thank y'all.
Winona,